Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. We've talked before on this channel about pirates, about Tortuga and its buccaneers, about Henry Morgan and his extraordinary raid on Panama, about the men who wrote the articles and elected their captains and spent their prize money in ways that contemporary moralists found shocking and that historians have found persistently fascinating. Tonight we're going to tell a related but distinct story. Not the story of the pirates themselves exactly, but the story of the places that made them possible. The harbours, the towns, the ports that knew perfectly well what was being bought and sold on their waterfronts, and that chose, for reasons that were sometimes economic and sometimes political and sometimes purely practical, to ask very few questions about where it came from. Tonight we're talking about the pirate haven, the specific kind of place that the golden age of piracy required in order to function, and the specific kinds of places that the Caribbean and the Atlantic world provided between roughly 1650 and 1730. We are talking about Port Royal in Jamaica, which was the most spectacular of them, and whose end was the most dramatic. We are talking about Nassau in the Bahamas, which was the last and in some ways the most fully realised expression of the pirate haven as a political and social project. We are talking about Tortuga, which we have covered before but which looks different when viewed as a haven rather than as a buccaneer camp. We are talking about Madagascar, which was the furthest extension of the pirate world and the most improbable pirate haven in the history of the Atlantic Age. And we're talking about the dozens of smaller anchorages, the unnamed coves and shallow inlets and provisioning stops that were the connective tissue of the pirate economy, and that never made it into the dramatic histories, but without which none of the dramatic histories would have been possible. The pirate haven was not a simple thing. It was not merely a place where pirates anchored their ships. It was an economic and social institution of considerable complexity, providing specific goods and services to a clientele whose needs were specific and whose money, while of uncertain origin, spent exactly like anyone else's money once it reached shore. To think about what the pirate haven actually was, it helps to think about what it was not. It was not a criminal hideout in the sense that the word suggests, a concealed place where illegal activity occurred in secret, hidden from the authorities. The pirate havens were, at the height of their operation, thoroughly public places. The prizes were sold openly. The captains recruited crews openly. The taverns served known pirates without pretending they were anything else. The merchants who bought prize goods were not hiding their purchases. The governors who tolerated or encouraged the pirate economy were not ignorant of what was happening in their harbours. Port Royal and Nassau in their Golden Age periods were the least secret criminal enterprises in the history of Atlantic commerce. They operated in the open because they had the political protection, the commercial integration, and the practical power to do so without needing the concealment that a genuinely vulnerable criminal enterprise would have required. What the pirate haven was, in its most functional form, was a port town organised around the specific commercial needs of a specific clientele, men who made their living by taking things that other people owned and who needed the same things that every maritime commercial community needed: harbour facilities, provisioning, commercial services, and the social infrastructure that supports human beings who spend months at sea in dangerous circumstances and need to spend a period ashore before going back. The haven was the shore end of the pirate operation, the onshore infrastructure without which the maritime activity could not be sustained, and it was built and maintained by the same commercial logic that built and maintained every other kind of port town, by the people who stood to profit from providing what the clientele needed. It was an economic and social institution of considerable complexity, providing specific goods and services to a clientele whose needs were specific and whose money, while of uncertain origin, spent exactly like anyone else's money once it reached shore. The haven required infrastructure, and understanding what that infrastructure actually consisted of brings the abstract idea of a pirate haven into the specific, physical, sweaty reality that the term describes. The most fundamental requirement, and the one that determined where pirate havens could and could not develop, was the ability to careen ships. Careening was the process by which the hull of a wooden sailing ship was cleaned of the marine growth. The barnacles and the shipworms and the various other organisms that the warm tropical waters of the Caribbean encouraged, that accumulated on any vessel operating in those waters. A ship's hull that had not been careened for several months became progressively slower and less manoeuvrable as the marine growth thickened on the planking, eventually reaching a point where the vessel was sluggish enough to be caught by faster ships and too slow to catch prizes of its own. For a pirate vessel, which depended on speed for both the capture of prizes and the escape from the naval vessels that were periodically sent to suppress piracy, hull fouling was not merely a maintenance issue, it was an existential threat. A pirate ship that could not be regularly careened was a pirate ship that would eventually be taken. The careening process required specific physical conditions. The ship had to be hauled onto a beach or into shallow water, tipped on its side and the growth removed from the exposed hull with scrapers and torches. The torches used to burn off the most stubborn accumulations, the scrapers to remove what the torches did not reach. The process repeated on both sides before the hull was caulked with oakum, pitched, and the ship refloated. The beach had to be of a specific character, sandy enough to allow the ship to be dragged onto it without damage, firm enough to support the weight of the vessel on its side, sufficiently sheltered from wave action to allow the work to proceed without the ship being moved by the sea. The careening of a large vessel required a labour force of 20 or 30 men working over several days, with the ship's guns, stores, and movable equipment offloaded first to reduce the weight. During the careening period, the ship and its crew were completely vulnerable. The vessel was on its side on a beach, unmanned, while the crew worked on its hull. The havens that provided the best careening facilities were the ones that attracted the most pirates, and the geography of the Golden Age pirate world was substantially determined by the geography of suitable careening beaches. Nassau's harbour had specific beaches on nearby islands that were well adapted to careening. Port Royal's position gave access to the beaches of the Jamaican coast. The various coves and inlets of the Bahamas and the Turks and Caicos provided dozens of smaller careening spots for vessels that needed to work away from the main haven. Madagascar's long coastline and numerous sheltered bays made it particularly well suited for the purposes of vessels operating in the Indian Ocean. The map of pirate activity in the Golden Age is substantially a map of suitable careening locations, and the haven that could offer good careening combined with provisioning and prize markets was the haven that attracted the most commerce and the most powerful captains. The haven required infrastructure, harbour facilities capable of careening the hulls of sailing ships that needed to be cleaned of the marine growth that accumulated in tropical waters, and that, if left unchecked, slowed a vessel to the point where pursuit and escape became equally impossible. It required provisioning, the food and water and alcohol and naval stores that a ship needed to make another voyage. It required a market for prizes, a place where captured cargo could be sold without too many questions about the circumstances of its acquisition. It required, perhaps most importantly, a social environment capable of absorbing a large population of men with violent professional histories, significant disposable income, and the specific psychological character that the pirate trade selected for, without that social environment immediately destroying itself. This was not a trivial organizational challenge, and the specific ways in which different pirate havens met or failed to meet it is one of the more interesting questions in the social history of early modern crime. Before we go any further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely the kind of thing you come here for. It makes a real difference. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights if you haven't already. Let the room settle into something soft. Find a comfortable position and let your shoulders drop. You have nowhere to be. And let us go back to the Caribbean at the end of the 17th century, to the most famous and the most spectacular of all the pirate havens, the town that contemporaries called the wickedest city on earth. Port Royal sits on the end of a narrow spit of sand and gravel that forms the southern side of Kingston Harbour on the island of Jamaica, and its specific geography. The spit extends into the harbour like a pointing finger, providing deep water on both sides and a naturally sheltered anchorage of excellent quality. Made it from the beginning one of the finest harbours in the Caribbean. The English took Jamaica from Spain in 1655 during Oliver Cromwell's Western design, the ambitious scheme to seize the Spanish Caribbean that was the first serious English attempt to project military power at imperial scale. And they found on the Palisadoes spit a small Spanish settlement that they expanded and fortified into what would become the primary naval base for English operations in the Caribbean. Fort Charles, built at the tip of the spit to command the harbour entrance, was the nucleus around which the town of Port Royal grew, and by the 1660s and 1670s the town had developed into something that was simultaneously a functioning English colonial settlement, a major trading port, and the centre of the English privateering enterprise in the Caribbean. The Jamaica that Port Royal served was, in the first 2 decades after the English conquest, a colony in genuine economic and demographic difficulty. The island was fertile enough, and its climate was suitable for sugar production, but the capital and the labour required to establish the plantation economy had not yet fully arrived. The Spanish population had largely fled rather than submit to English rule. The indigenous Taino were long gone, destroyed in the century of Spanish occupation. The African population that would eventually constitute the colony's workforce was still comparatively small, the slave trade not yet having reached the volume that the sugar economy would eventually demand. In the interim, the Jamaica administration, under a succession of governors, found that the most reliable source of revenue, the most effective mechanism of colonial defence, and the most powerful instrument for establishing English commercial interests in the region was the English privateers, the captains with royal commissions who attacked Spanish shipping and Spanish coastal settlements, brought their prizes to Port Royal, and distributed their proceeds through the town's economy in ways that stimulated every sector of colonial commerce. The governors who presided over Port Royal in its heyday, Thomas Modiford above all, who governed Jamaica from 1664 to 1671, understood the specific bargain they were making with the privateering community. The privateers provided military protection for a colony that the English navy could not adequately garrison, conducting aggressive operations against Spanish settlements and shipping that deterred Spanish counterattack and that aligned with the English crown's strategic interest in weakening Spain's Caribbean position. In exchange, the privateers received the harbour facilities, the legal protection, and the commercial infrastructure of Port Royal, the ability to sell their prizes openly, to recruit crews, to refit their ships, and to spend their money in a town whose commercial establishment had organised itself around exactly those needs. Modiford's relationship with Henry Morgan was the most famous expression of this arrangement, but it was a structural feature of Port Royal's existence rather than the personal project of any particular governor. and it persisted through the 1660s and 1670s because the people involved found it mutually advantageous. What did Port Royal actually look like at its peak in the 1680s? The accounts that survive, from travellers, merchants, naval officers, and the religious critics whose denunciations are among the most vivid primary sources for the period, describe a town of perhaps 6,000 to 7,000 people packed onto the Palisadoes spit with a density that the hot Caribbean climate made uncomfortable, and that the combination of wooden buildings, open drains, and the human waste of a densely crowded population made medically dangerous. The waterfront was lined with wharves and warehouses where the goods of the Atlantic trade and the goods of the prize trade, which was the same thing seen from a different angle, were stored and exchanged. The streets immediately behind the waterfront were dense with taverns, lodging houses, and the establishments that provisioned ships and entertained their crews in the specific ways that port towns had always organised around. Contemporary accounts enumerate the taverns of Port Royal with a specificity that suggests both the observer's fascination and the establishment's prominence. One account from the 1680s counts over 100 taverns for a town of 6,000 or 7,000 people, a ratio of drinking establishments to population that modern observers find remarkable, and that the town's specific economic character explains. The goods that moved through Port Royal's waterfront were an index of the Caribbean's entire commercial world. Sugar and rum from the Jamaican plantations, manufactured goods from England, cloth, tools, weapons, the hardware of plantation agriculture and colonial household management, enslaved people from West Africa, passing through Port Royal on their way to the Jamaican sugar estates, one of the most profitable and most brutal dimensions of the town's commerce, and the prizes, the captured cargoes of Spanish and occasionally French and Dutch merchant ships that the privateers brought in, stripped of their original documentation, given new manifests that describe their contents in ways that the Port Royal merchant establishment found plausible, and sold through the commercial networks of a town that had become expert in the specific paperwork of making stolen goods respectable. The role of the merchants in Port Royal's pirate economy is one that the swashbuckling narrative consistently underemphasises, but it deserves to be examined with the specificity that the economic relationship requires, because the merchants were not peripheral facilitators of a pirate enterprise that existed independently of them. They were structural components of the enterprise without whom it could not have functioned at the scale it achieved. Consider the problem from the pirate crew's perspective. A successful cruise produced a hold full of goods, bolts of cloth, casks of wine and brandy, bags of cocoa and indigo and sugar, chests of silver plate, bales of tobacco, barrels of salted fish, the 1,000 miscellaneous commodities of the Atlantic trade in whatever combination a particular prize's cargo happened to contain. These goods had real market value. Converting them to usable cash required a market, a buyer willing to purchase the cargo, no questions asked, at a price that reflected both the goods' value and the seller's need for speed and discretion. The pirates needed to sell quickly, before their presence in the harbour attracted naval attention, and they needed to sell without documentation that would connect the transaction to a specific prize ship whose owners might be pursuing legal remedies. The merchant who could provide these conditions, cash, speed, silence, was providing a service whose value to the seller was high enough to justify a substantial discount from the goods' market price. The merchant's perspective was different, but equally rational. Prize goods purchased at 40 or 50% of their legitimate market value, from sellers who needed the transaction completed before the next naval patrol arrived, and then sold through legitimate commercial channels with appropriate documentation, represented a profit margin considerably higher than the legitimate trade could provide, The risk was real. A merchant discovered purchasing pirate goods could face prosecution, but the risk was manageable in environments where the colonial administration was either complicit or insufficiently resourced to investigate, and the profits were sufficient to justify the risk management costs. The Port Royal merchants who built fortunes in the 1660s and 1670s were, many of them, built on exactly this business model. The specific commercial arrangements through which prize goods moved from pirate hands to legitimate markets were varied and sometimes ingenious. The most straightforward was direct sale to a local merchant, who paid cash and absorbed all subsequent risk. More sophisticated arrangements involved consignment. The pirates left the goods with a merchant for sale at the best available price, receiving payment after the sale, which gave the merchant more time and flexibility to find buyers without creating the urgent need for a quick transaction that direct sale implied. The most elaborate arrangements involved the creation of paper documentation that transformed stolen goods into legitimately acquired ones through the invention of transactions that the colonial court system lacked the investigative capacity to question. A cargo of sugar listed as purchased from a Hispaniola planter, with documentation prepared by a notary whose practice included whatever services his client's commercial needs required, was a cargo that the legitimate trade could absorb without obvious difficulty. The role of the merchants in Port Royal's pirate economy is one that the swashbuckling narrative of Golden Age piracy consistently underemphasizes, but it was absolutely central to the way the system functioned. A pirate crew that returned to port with a hold full of silver and indigo and cacao had three immediate problems: how to sell the cargo, how to convert the proceeds into usable currency, and how to do both without the kind of documentation that a legitimate merchant transaction would require. The merchants of Port Royal and their counterparts in Nassau or in Tortuga in the various other havens were the solution to all three problems simultaneously. They bought the cargo at prices that reflected both its value and the legal risk of the transaction, providing the pirate crew with cash while absorbing a commodity that they then moved through the legitimate trade networks with whatever documentation their expertise in colonial commercial paperwork could provide. The profit margin on prize goods was substantial, because the buyer's price reflected not just the market value of the cargo, but the discount for cash, the premium for silence, and the risk-adjusted return on an investment that could, in the wrong political climate, result in criminal prosecution. Port Royal's merchants were not neutral facilitators. They were partners in the enterprise, and the town's prosperity was their prosperity. The specific figure of John White, a Port Royal merchant of the 1680s, whose business records have been partially preserved and studied by historians, illustrates the integration of legitimate and pirate commerce in the town's economy. White traded in sugar and rum and the provisions of plantation agriculture alongside the regular purchase of prize goods from privateer and pirate crews. His account books record transactions whose nature is not always clearly distinguished. Goods acquired from passing ships, goods consigned by captains whose names appear elsewhere in the records of the Admiralty courts that periodically prosecuted piracy, goods whose descriptions and quantities match the known cargoes of vessels reported missing in Spanish colonial records. He was not an outlier. He was a successful participant in an economy that had been organized around exactly this kind of ambiguity since the town's founding. The legal geography of piracy in this period was itself a significant contributor to the prosperity of Port Royal and the other havens, because the distinction between legitimate privateering and outright piracy was one that the colonial administration of Jamaica managed with a deliberate flexibility that served commercial interests. A captain with a letter of marque was a privateer. A captain without one was a pirate. The same captain, the same crew, the same ship, the same set of actions. What determined which category applied was the piece of paper, and the piece of paper was something that the governor's office controlled. When England was at war with Spain, the letters flowed freely. When the Treaty of Madrid of 1670 committed England to suppressing privateering against Spanish possessions, the letters dried up. But the captains who had been getting them found, with minimal disruption to their professional activities, that the Caribbean contained non-Spanish targets in sufficient quantity to maintain a viable income, and that Port Royal remained as receptive as ever to their custom. The earthquake that destroyed Port Royal on June 7th, 1692, is one of those events in Atlantic history whose dramatic timing and dramatic completeness has made it irresistible to moralists, novelists, and historians of every subsequent generation. At 11:43 in the morning, the time is unusually precise for the 17th century, preserved in a letter written on the day of the earthquake by a Jamaican merchant who happened to record it. The earthquake struck. Port Royal was built, as we have noted, on the Palisadoes Spit, a formation of sand and gravel compacted by centuries of tidal action into something that appeared solid enough to build a city on, but that, under the kind of seismic stress that a major earthquake generates, behaved not like solid ground, but like a liquid. The process is called liquefaction. The ground loses its structural integrity under vibration and begins to flow like a very thick fluid, and the specific geology of the Palisadoes was almost perfectly calibrated to produce catastrophic liquefaction under exactly the kind of seismic loading that the 1692 earthquake provided. The effects were immediate and total. Entire streets slid into the harbour as the ground beneath them liquefied and flowed. Buildings that had stood for decades collapsed in seconds. The harbour itself was disturbed into a small tsunami that swamped ships and swept across what remained of the waterfront. The death toll in the immediate earthquake and the flooding that followed was approximately 2,000 people, roughly a third of Port Royal's population dying in a matter of minutes. Another 2,000 died in the days and weeks following, from injuries, from disease in the disrupted water supply, from the general collapse of the town's medical and social infrastructure. The ships in the harbour were thrown against each other and against the shore. The warehouses that had held the commercial wealth of the English Caribbean were shaken apart, their contents scattered across the harbour bottom where, 300 years later, archaeologists would find them. What the archaeologists found when they began systematic excavation of the submerged remains of Port Royal in the 20th century was one of the most extraordinary time capsules in the archaeology of the early modern period. Because the earthquake had struck in the middle of the morning, a working day, a time when the town's commercial and domestic life was in full activity, and because the liquefaction had dropped significant portions of the town into the harbour in essentially intact condition rather than simply demolishing it, the underwater site contained the contents of houses, shops, taverns, and warehouses in a state of preservation that normal archaeological contexts almost never provide. Pewter dishes still on their tables. Watches stopped at 11:43, preserved in the anaerobic mud of the harbour bottom. The shop of a pewterer named Simon Benning, identified by his marked goods, with his stock still arranged as it had been at the moment of the earthquake. A turtle crawl, the pen in which live turtles were kept to be sold as food, a standard feature of Caribbean port town commerce, with the wooden framework intact, the material culture of a Caribbean pirate haven at the exact moment of its destruction, as complete as if someone had wrapped it in cotton and locked it away for archaeologists to find. The moral interpretation of the earthquake's timing and completeness was supplied immediately and at length by the religious community of the Atlantic world. the destruction of the wickedest city on earth at the hands of an angry providence was a narrative that wrote itself, and it was written repeatedly by men who had been telling the inhabitants of Port Royal what God thought of their commerce for years. The Reverend Emmanuel Heath, an Anglican minister who had been serving in Port Royal and who survived the earthquake by being on the waterfront at the time, wrote one of the most detailed eyewitness accounts of the disaster, and one that combined genuine compassion for the victims with the theological interpretation that the disaster was divine judgment delivered to a community that had been warned. He was not wrong that Port Royal had been warned. Whether he was right about the divine judgment is a question that lies outside the competence of historical analysis. The commercial consequences of the earthquake were not, in practice, as permanent as the providential narrative implied they should be. Port Royal was partially rebuilt and partially continued to function as a harbour and trading centre, but the town never recovered its previous scale, and its commercial functions were gradually absorbed by the settlement of Kingston, developing on the mainland shore of the harbour that would become the island's dominant city. The pirate haven function of Port Royal had already been in decline before the earthquake. The tightening of the legal framework and the increasing effectiveness of naval enforcement having reduced the volume of prize commerce that was the haven's economic engine. What the earthquake did was to accelerate a decline that was already underway, and to create the specific dramatic endpoint that made Port Royal's story complete, in a way that gradual commercial decline would not have. Before Nassau there was Tortuga, and before Port Royal reached its height there was Tortuga, and the reason Tortuga deserves revisiting in the context of the pirate haven, even having given it its own episode on this channel, is that the two framings produce genuinely different understandings of the same place. When you look at Tortuga as a buccaneer camp, you see a community of hunters who became maritime raiders. When you look at it as a pirate haven, you see the prototype of an institutional model that Nassau and Port Royal would refine and elaborate across the following decades. What Tortuga provided that no previous Caribbean location had provided was the specific combination of defensible geography, accessible harbour, and political ambiguity that the pirate haven required. Jean Levasseur's fort on the hill commanded the harbour approaches in a way that made Spanish raids costly and complicated rather than routine. The narrow channel between Tortuga and Hispaniola gave the fort's cannon a killing ground that attacking vessels could not bypass. The harbour itself, while not deep enough for the largest vessels, was adequate for the brigs and sloops that were the workhorses of Caribbean raiding. And the political ambiguity. The island was claimed by France, but governed by men who had their own ideas about the relationship between their commission from the French colonial company and the specific decisions they made about who was welcome in the harbour, gave the settlement the legal flexibility that a haven required. The specific institutional innovation that Tortuga contributed to the history of the pirate haven was the development of a shore establishment organised specifically around the needs of the raiding community. The taverns and trading houses that appeared on Tortuga's waterfront in the 1640s and 1650s were not serving an agricultural or fishing community that happened to have pirates among its customers. They were organised from the beginning around the specific transaction of a privateer or buccaneer crew arriving in harbour with prizes and needing food, alcohol, equipment, and a market for what they had taken. The Tortuga shore establishment was pirate-specific in a way that earlier haven-like places had not been, and the model it established, the waterfront organised around the commercial needs of maritime raiders, with the political authority of the settlement calibrated to tolerate and profit from that commerce, was the model that Port Royal and Nassau would carry forward. The decline of Tortuga as the primary pirate haven was not the result of enforcement or suppression. It was the result of competition. The emergence of Port Royal in Jamaica, as a better resourced, better located and politically more sophisticated expression of the same institutional model. Jamaica's governor had more authority, more resources and more commercial connections than Tortuga's French colonial administrators. Port Royal's harbour was deeper and more capacious. The commercial establishment that grew around Port Royal's waterfront was richer and more capable of absorbing prize goods at scale. Tortuga did not disappear. It continued to function as a secondary haven, particularly for French filibusters who preferred a French colonial context to the English administration at Port Royal. But the centre of gravity of Caribbean piracy shifted to Jamaica in the 1660s and stayed there until the earthquake of 1692 and the political changes of the 1680s ended Port Royal's golden age. The Nassau that emerged as the successor to Port Royal and to Tortuga, and to the various smaller havens that the consolidating colonial powers were progressively closing through the 1680s and 1690s, was a different kind of pirate haven in ways that reflect the changed circumstances of the early 18th century. Nassau, on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, was not primarily a privateering base with a commercial town attached to it. It was something closer to a pirate republic, a community that had developed in the power vacuum created by the collapse of effective colonial governance in the Bahamas, and that had organised itself around piracy as its primary economic activity, with a thoroughness that no previous pirate haven had quite matched. The Bahamas were a collection of low-lying limestone islands and cays scattered across the western Atlantic between Florida and Hispaniola, and they had been nominally English since the Restoration of 1660, when Charles II had granted them as part of the proprietorial colony of Carolina. The proprietors had never invested seriously in the Bahamas, their attention being absorbed by the more commercially promising mainland territories. What governance the islands received was thin, distant and intermittent, and the population that accumulated on New Providence and the surrounding islands in the late 17th century was the kind of population that ungoverned spaces attract: escaped servants, small traders operating at the margins of the colonial economy, the kind of mobile, adaptable people who preferred the absence of authority to the constraints that authority imposed. The specific event that turned Nassau from a struggling marginal settlement into the capital of what historians call the Golden Age of piracy was the War of the Spanish Succession, which consumed Europe from 1701 to 1714. The war, which pitted France and Spain against Britain and the Dutch Republic in a conflict over the Spanish throne, was fought at sea as well as on land, and the Caribbean was one of its primary theatres. British privateers, authorised by letters of marque to attack French and Spanish shipping, flooded the Caribbean during the war years, using Nassau, with its excellent harbour and its position at the intersection of the major shipping lanes, as one of their primary bases. The harbour of Nassau could shelter dozens of ships in reasonable security. The Bahamian Islands provided food and water and the specific timber and naval stores that ships needed to maintain themselves. The town on New Providence had taverns and traders and the various commercial establishments that privateering crews required. When the war ended in 1714 with the Treaty of Utrecht, the specific problem that had always attended the demobilization of wartime privateers reasserted itself with particular force. Several thousand men who had spent the preceding decade attacking Spanish and French ships under legitimate commissions found that peace had rendered their profession illegal without providing any alternative means of supporting themselves. The transition from privateer to pirate was for many of them not a moral decision but a practical one. They knew how to attack ships and take their cargoes. They had the ships and the men and the skills, and the only thing that had changed was the piece of paper. The privateers who gathered at Nassau in the years immediately following 1714 and who became the founding population of what historians now call the Republic of Pirates, were not, for the most part, men who had become pirates by philosophical conviction. They were men who had been pirates with licenses, and who had become pirates without them because peace had taken the licenses away. The governance, or rather the specific kind of organised ungoverning, that developed at Nassau in the years between 1714 and 1718 was one of the most remarkable episodes in the political history of the early modern Atlantic world, and it has attracted the attention of political theorists as well as historians precisely because it represents an empirical case of a community organising itself outside the framework of any existing state, and producing, through collective necessity, institutional arrangements that actually functioned. The captains who used Nassau as their base, Benjamin Hornigold, Charles Vane, Edward Teach, who would become Blackbeard, Calico Jack Rackham, Samuel Bellamy, Charles Levasseur, were not operating under any unified command or any formal authority. They were competitors as much as they were colleagues, competing for crew members, for prizes, for the commercial relationships with Nassau's merchants that gave their prizes value. But they were also members of a community that needed certain minimum conditions to function, and the specific ways in which that community maintained those minimum conditions are worth understanding. The most basic condition was the harbour itself. Nassau's harbour required maintenance, the periodic clearing of the channel, the repair of the basic infrastructure that allowed ships to be careened and victualled, the provision of fresh water. These were collective goods that no individual captain could provide alone, and that all of them needed. The Nassau pirate community maintained them through a combination of informal collective action and the contributions of the shore establishment, the tavern keepers, the merchants, the craftsmen who made their living from the pirates' custom, and who had obvious interests in maintaining the infrastructure that the custom required. There was no government to levy taxes for harbour maintenance. There was an informal economy in which the people who depended on the harbour's functioning contributed to it in various ways, because the alternative was a harbour that didn't function. The second condition was something like security. Not the security provided by a state's legal system, which was entirely absent, but the security of a reputation and a community that maintained enough internal order to make Nassau a place where commerce could occur rather than a place where every arrival was immediately robbed by every resident. Pirates did rob each other occasionally, but the pirates of Nassau understood that a haven that devoured its own customers would cease to function as a haven, and the community norm against preying on other community members had the quality of a self-enforcing equilibrium, not a law, but a practical arrangement that most people found it in their interest to maintain most of the time. The most sophisticated element of Nassau's internal governance was the dispute resolution system that developed around the pirate articles and the informal authority of the senior captains. When pirates had disputes about prize shares, about the conduct of operations, about the various personal and professional conflicts that men in a violent trade generate in quantity, the resolution of those disputes happened through the same collective mechanisms that governed the articles, the community of captains and senior crew members serving as an informal tribunal, reaching decisions by a combination of precedent, consensus, and the practical authority of whoever commanded the most respect and the most armed followers in the harbour at any given moment. It was not justice in any formal sense, but it was a system that kept disagreements from escalating into the internal violence that would have destroyed the community most of the time, and that gave participants enough confidence in the outcome to bring their disputes to it, rather than resolving them with immediate violence. The specific individuals who populated Nassau in the years between 1714 and 1718 are some of the most colourful and best documented figures in the history of Atlantic piracy, and they deserve more than the brief catalogue of their names that the standard accounts provide. Benjamin Hornigold was one of the founding figures of Nassau's pirate community, a man who'd been active in the Caribbean since the early 1700s, and whose specific significance lay in his role as mentor and employer of several of the most famous pirates of the Golden Age, including Edward Teach and Samuel Bellamy. Hornigold had a complicated relationship to the political dimensions of his trade. He reportedly refused in the early years of his Nassau career to attack English ships, limiting his operations to Spanish and French vessels, a position that was simultaneously a moral stance and a hedge against the specific legal consequences that attacking British subjects would invite. He eventually accepted a pardon from the new Bahamian governor Woodes Rogers in 1718 and spent his last years hunting the former colleagues. He had declined to join in refusing the pardon. Samuel Bellamy, Black Sam Bellamy, as he appears in some accounts, a nickname whose origin is not fully clear but whose association with his dark hair and his reportedly handsome appearance has attached itself to his historical image, was perhaps the most philosophically interesting of the Nassau pirates, and the speech attributed to him in the account given by Philip Ashton, a young fisherman who was briefly captured by Bellamy's crew, is one of the most quoted passages in the literature of piracy. Whether Bellamy actually said anything like what Ashton reported is not verifiable, but the speech as recorded captures something genuine about the self-understanding of the pirate community at its most self-aware. The rich, Bellamy is reported to have told a merchant captain who refused to join his crew, "Rob the poor under the cover of law, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage." The speech is the pirate as social critic, reading the commercial society of his time with the specific perspective of someone who operates outside its legal frameworks, but within its economic world, and seeing clearly the way in which the legal frameworks serve the interests of the people who make them. Whether or not Bellamy said it, the sentiment was not unusual in the pirate community of Nassau, and it explains something about the specific appeal of the pirate life to men who have been servants and soldiers and the lower orders of Atlantic commercial society before they became pirates. Bellamy died in 1717 when his flagship Wider galley foundered in a storm off Cape Cod, taking more than 100 of his crew with it. The Wider was, until it sank, one of the most valuable prizes taken during the Golden Age. A former slave ship whose hull was full of not just the proceeds of piracy, but the specific irony of a ship built for the slave trade being converted into the flagship of a democratic pirate republic. The wreck of the Wider, discovered by Barry Clifford in 1984 and still being excavated, is the only fully authenticated pirate shipwreck from the Golden Age, and the artifacts it has yielded, the gold and silver and jewellery and weapons and personal items of the crew, provide the same kind of specific material human texture to the Golden Age narrative that the Port Royal excavations provide to the earlier period. Before we discuss the gender politics of the pirate haven, it is worth pausing on the daily reality of the pirate ship that the haven existed to support, because the haven cannot be understood without understanding what the men arriving in it had just come from, and why the specific pleasures and provisions that the haven offered were so intensely valued. The romantic image of the pirate life in popular culture has systematically replaced the actual experience of serving on a pirate vessel with a version that emphasizes the adventure and elides the monotony, the discomfort and the mortality that characterize the real thing. A pirate ship at sea was a working vessel, and the work of maintaining a sailing ship in the early 18th century was continuous, physically demanding, and performed in conditions that modern observers would find difficult to inhabit. The rigging required constant attention, ropes that chafed and wore under the constant movement of wind and wave, sails that needed repair, the blocks and tackles and cleats and halyards of a complex machine that required skilled hands continuously. The hull required pumping. Wooden ships of the period leaked constantly, some more than others, and the pump was a permanent feature of daily life on any vessel, not a crisis response. The guns required maintenance, cleaned, oiled, inspected. The carriages checked for the rotten wear that tropical conditions accelerated. The food required preparation, the ship's cook producing from the stores of salt meat and ship's biscuit and dried peas and whatever fresh provisions remained from the last landfall, whatever could be made to seem like a meal, in a galley whose fire was a constant fire hazard, and whose ventilation was inadequate for the heat of the tropical climate. The diet was one of the defining features of the seafaring life in this period, and it was inadequate in ways that had real consequences for the health and the combat effectiveness of the crew. Salt meat, beef or pork preserved in brine, stored in wooden casks that absorbed salt and water and occasionally harboured anaerobic bacteria that the brine concentration had not fully suppressed, was the staple protein, and its quality varied from the merely unpleasant to the genuinely dangerous depending on how long it had been in the cask and the conditions of its storage. Ship's biscuit, the dense, hard, long-lasting bread substitute that was the sailor's carbohydrate staple, was nutritionally adequate when fresh and colonized by weevils within weeks in the tropical climate, at which point the sailors ate it anyway because the alternative was not eating. The scurvy that resulted from vitamin C deficiency was a constant threat on long voyages, and the specific knowledge of its prevention, citrus fruit, fresh vegetables, was unevenly distributed in the early 18th century, with some pirate captains apparently understanding it intuitively and others not. The hierarchy of the pirate ship was, by the standards of the period, remarkably flat, but it was not non-existent. The captain had real authority in combat. The articles typically specified that his word was law during an engagement, and a successful captain who had brought his crew through difficult situations commanded the kind of loyalty that real achievement generates. The quartermaster was the elected representative of the crew's collective interests, managing the stores and the prize distribution and serving as a check on the captain's authority outside of combat situations. Below the officers, the crew was organized around the specific skills that a sailing ship required: the master who handled navigation, the carpenter and his mates who maintained the hull, the gunner and his crew who managed the cannon, the sailmaker, the cook, the surgeon, and the mass of ordinary seamen who performed the general labour of the vessel under the direction of whoever was senior in the immediate task. The boredom was the dimension of the seafaring life that the adventure narrative most thoroughly omits. A pirate cruise in the early 18th century might cover thousands of miles of ocean and take weeks between prizes, weeks of sailing, watching, waiting, performing the routine maintenance that a wooden ship in tropical waters required, arguing about small matters because there were no large matters to occupy the attention, and drinking rum in quantities calibrated to make the waiting more bearable without making the seamanship impossible. The specific management of boredom and its consequences, the quarrels, the gambling, the depression that long confinement and inactivity produced in violent men, was one of the practical challenges of pirate command, and the article's specific provisions about when drinking was permitted and what forms of conflict were prohibited reflected the accumulated practical experience of the community about what happened to a crew's cohesion when boredom and alcohol and confined space combined without organizational management. The gender politics of the pirate haven are one of the most interesting and least adequately treated dimensions of the Golden Age story, and they deserve more than the brief mention of Anne Bonny and Mary Red that most accounts provide. The pirate ships of the Golden Age were, with very few exceptions, entirely male environments. Women were not part of the crew and were typically prohibited by the Articles from being brought aboard ship. But the pirate haven was not the pirate ship. It was a shore community with the full range of demographic diversity that shore communities possess, and the women of Nassau and Port Royal and the other havens were present in ways that the maritime-focused historical literature has consistently underrepresented. The wives and female partners of pirates were among the most important participants in the haven economy. A pirate captain who had been at sea for months and who returned to Nassau with a hold full of prize goods had immediate practical needs that shore-based relationships organised. The women who maintained households in Nassau, whether as wives, as partners, as tavern keepers, or as the various other commercial and domestic roles that the haven's economy required, were managing the interface between the maritime world of the pirate crews and the shore world of the haven's social life. They received the prize money and managed it through the periods when their partners were at sea. They maintained the social connections that organised the haven's informal political life. They ran the establishments that the returning crews patronised. The economic contribution of the women of Nassau to the haven's functioning was substantial, and its invisibility in the standard accounts reflects the invisibility of women's economic contributions in the historical record of the period, rather than their actual absence from the economic life being described. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are the exceptions who prove the rule. They are famous precisely because they were exceptions, women who actually sailed on pirate ships at a time when the articles of most pirate vessels explicitly prohibited it. Their story, as recorded in Captain Johnson's General History and in the accounts of their trial in Jamaica in 1720, has attracted the attention of historians interested in gender, sexuality, and the specific conditions under which women could participate in male-dominated activities in the early 18th century. Both women were convicted of piracy. Mary Red died in prison before she could be executed, of a fever contracted during her imprisonment. Anne Bonny's fate is genuinely unknown. She disappears from the records after her reprieve from execution on grounds of pregnancy, which is itself a demonstration that the historical record preserves the women of the pirate world selectively and partially, tracking them when they appear in courts or crises, and losing them when they return to the ordinary texture of daily life. The indigenous peoples of the Bahamas and the Caribbean more broadly occupied a complicated position relative to the pirate havens, sometimes victims of pirate raids, sometimes providers of the food and water and local knowledge that pirate ships needed, sometimes participants in the pirate economy in ways that the surviving records document imperfectly. The Lucayan people who had originally inhabited the Bahamas had been enslaved and removed by the Spanish in the early 16th century, their population entirely destroyed within decades of European contact. The indigenous peoples of the larger Caribbean islands were in various states of accommodation and resistance to the European colonial order by the time of the Golden Age, and their interactions with the pirate community were shaped by the specific political circumstances of their own relationships to the colonial powers whose shipping the pirates were attacking. Before we examine the regulatory tightening that ended the Golden Age, we need to spend some time with the man whose career best illustrates both the Golden Age's final flowering and its inevitable end. Bartholomew Roberts, who was the most successful pirate of the entire Golden Age in terms of prizes taken, and whose death in February 1722 is as good a marker as any for the moment when the era was definitively over. Roberts, Black Bart as his reputation has christened him, though the nickname does not appear in the historical sources of his own time, was a Welsh sailor from Pembrokeshire who was captured by the pirate Howell Davis in 1719, and who, following Davis's death in a botched ambush at the Portuguese island of Principe off the West African coast, was elected captain by the crew in a vote whose specific circumstances the records preserve. He was not the most experienced pirate among Davis's crew at the time of his election. He was apparently the most capable. The crew's assessment proved correct in ways that the subsequent 3 years of Roberts's career would make spectacularly clear. Roberts took approximately 400 prizes in 3 years, a number that no other Golden Age pirate approaches, and that represents a level of sustained operational success that required not just courage and tactical ability, but the administrative and organizational intelligence to keep a crew of several hundred men working together across thousands of miles of ocean over an extended period. He operated in the Caribbean, along the North American coast and along the West African coast. 3 entirely different operational theatres, each with its own commercial geography and its own naval enforcement environment, with a flexibility and a geographic range that demonstrated the specific kind of strategic intelligence that distinguished the great pirate commanders from the merely competent ones. Roberts's articles, the specific governance document of his ships, have been preserved in Captain Johnson's account and are among the most detailed pirate articles that survive from the Golden Age. They specified the equal vote of every crew member in important decisions. They established the compensation schedule for injuries. They regulated the hours during which lights and drinking were permitted below decks. They prohibited fighting aboard ship, requiring that disputes be settled ashore, a provision whose practical wisdom is evident from the mathematics of a ship with hundreds of armed and volatile men confined in close quarters. They also prohibited women aboard, which was a standard provision of pirate articles and was presumably aimed at the specific social disruptions that competition for women aboard ship would create, rather than at any principal position on gender. Roberts himself was reportedly a teetotaler, drinking tea in a milieu where rum was the primary currency of social life, and his personal austerity was apparently compatible with very effective command rather than being, as it might have been in a different context, an alienating display of superiority. His death on February 10, 1722, off the Cape Lopez coast of West Africa, was the result of an engagement with HMS Swallow, a Royal Navy frigate commanded by Captain Challoner Ogle, who had been specifically dispatched to suppress Roberts's operations. Roberts was shot by grape shot at the beginning of the engagement, grape shot being the anti-personnel ammunition loaded in naval guns for close-range fighting, and was apparently dead before his ship was fully engaged. His crew, following his standing orders to give him a sailor's burial if he was killed in action, threw his body overboard in his full fighting dress before HMS Swallow could take it. The Swallow then captured Roberts's ship, the Royal Fortune, after a battle that was decided partly by the naval superiority of a Royal Navy frigate and partly by the fact that a significant portion of Roberts's crew had been celebrating the previous evening with a prize Portuguese wine ship and were in no condition to fight effectively. The trial of Roberts's crew at Cape Coast Castle in West Africa in April 1722 was the largest piracy trial of the Golden Age and produced 52 hangings, the largest single mass execution in the history of English piracy law. The bodies were gibbeted on the West African coast as a warning to the ships passing through the area. The warning was effective, or at least it was followed by the effective collapse of West African piracy, which may have been coincidence or may have been causation. the evidence is not clear enough to attribute the decline to the Cape Coast Castle executions rather than to the broader tightening of naval enforcement that was occurring simultaneously across the Atlantic. The regulatory environment that the European colonial powers were constructing around the Caribbean in the years between 1670 and 1720 was the force that ultimately ended the Golden Age and closed the pirate havens, and understanding how it worked is as important to the story as understanding how the havens themselves worked. The closure of the pirate havens was not a single dramatic event. It was a process of progressive tightening, of increasing naval enforcement, of diplomatic arrangements between the colonial powers that progressively narrowed the legal spaces within which piracy could operate, and of the specific political decisions by colonial governors to stop tolerating what their predecessors had found convenient. The Piracy Act of 1700 was a significant legislative step in the British management of the piracy problem because it extended the jurisdiction of admiralty courts in the colonies to try piracy cases without reference to England. The previous requirement that pirates be transported to England for trial had been a practical barrier to prosecution that the colonial admiralty courts, once empowered, could address much more efficiently. The extension of the death penalty for piracy to cover a broader range of actions and accessories was accompanied by the machinery to actually enforce it in the colonial context, and the trials that followed in the Bahamian and Caribbean admiralty courts in the 1710s and 1720s were more numerous, more efficient, and more reliably fatal to the accused than the earlier period's prosecutions had been. The economics that supported the pirate havens were also changing in ways that the regulatory tightening was partly cause of and partly effect of. The sugar economy of the Caribbean had reached a level of commercial maturity by the early 18th century that made the disruption of merchant shipping, the disruption that piracy fundamentally consisted of, genuinely costly to the planter class and the merchant houses in ways that it had not been in the earlier period when Caribbean commerce was less organised and less valuable. The Jamaica Assembly, the representative body of the Jamaican planter class, was producing resolutions against piracy in the 1710s that would have been surprising from the same body a generation earlier, when its predecessors had cheerfully welcomed Henry Morgan home from Panama. The economic interests of the colonial establishment had shifted, and the political demand for the suppression of piracy was coming from within the colonial society as well as from London. The specific instrument of the Golden Age's closure was Woodes Rogers, and his story is worth telling in full detail rather than in the abbreviated form that the general narrative requires, because he is one of those figures whose personal history illuminates the history of the institution he was sent to dismantle, with the specific irony of having participated in it from the other side. Rogers had been born around 1679 in Poole in Dorset, the son of a sea captain, and had gone to sea young in the way that the maritime families of the period arrange for their children. His father died when he was young, and he made his own way through the Bristol Merchant Marine, eventually marrying the daughter of a prominent Bristol sea captain and establishing himself in the merchant community that organised and funded the privateering expeditions that were the legitimate version of what the Nassau pirates were doing without licences. The Bristol merchant community in the early 18th century was deeply involved in exactly the kind of Atlantic commerce, including the slave trade, that the pirate economy preyed on, and Rogers' position in it gave him both the commercial connections and the personal motivation to take piracy seriously as a problem rather than merely as a political abstraction. His circumnavigation of 1708 to 1711 was the venture that established his reputation and his finances, funded by Bristol merchants and conducted under a letter of marque that authorised attacks on Spanish shipping during the War of the Spanish Succession. The expedition was the most commercially successful English privateering voyage since Drake's circumnavigation of the 1570s. Rogers commanded 2 ships, the Duke and the Duchess, and navigated them through the Straits of Le Maire around Cape Horn, one of the most dangerous passages in the world, which Rogers managed in January 1709 with the seamanship that his subsequent reputation reflected, across the Pacific, along the Spanish Pacific coast, across the Indian Ocean, and home to England via the Cape of Good Hope. The rescue of Alexander Selkirk from Juan Fernandez Island, 4 years and 4 months alone on the island after being put ashore by a previous privateering expedition whose captain he had quarrelled with, was the expedition's most dramatically memorable episode, though commercially it was the prize of the Manila galleon Nuestra Señora de la Encarnación, taken off the Mexican coast, that produced the expedition's most significant revenue. Rogers returned to England in 1711 to find that the legal disputes about his prize claims, the complex financial arrangements of his backers, and the specific hostility of the East India Company, which objected to the expedition's trading in the Indian Ocean on the grounds that such trade infringed its monopoly, had consumed a substantial portion of the expedition's profits. He spent several years in legal and financial struggle before the appointment to the Bahamas governorship in 1717 offered a way out of his personal financial difficulties while also providing a genuinely important public function. His salary as governor was inadequate. His personal resources were not robust. The appointment was partly charity from political connections, and partly the recognition that a man who had successfully managed a privateering expedition around the world probably had the right combination of toughness and maritime knowledge to manage the former pirates he was being sent to suppress. His arrival at Nassau in July 1718 with a naval escort of 4 ships, a garrison of approximately 100 soldiers, and the royal pardon was a carefully stage-managed piece of political theatre. He knew that the pirates of Nassau were watching every detail of his arrival for signals about how he intended to conduct himself, and the combination of the pardon's generosity and the naval escort's implied threat was calibrated to communicate both the reward for compliance and the consequence of resistance. He knew the names of the major captains in the harbour. He knew who was likely to accept and who was likely to resist. He had, almost certainly, studied the social dynamics of the Nassau community before his arrival in ways that made his conduct once he was there more strategically coherent than a simple reading of the official record suggests. The Nassau that emerged from Rogers' pacification was not the same Nassau that had preceded it, but it was not unrecognisable either. The commercial waterfront continued. The taverns continued. The harbour continued to shelter ships whose commercial activities were not always entirely conventional. The difference was that the openly pirate economy, the prize goods sold without documentation, the captains who recruited crews in the public taverns for cruises that had no legal authorization, was gone, replaced by a more carefully managed ambiguity that the colonial administration could maintain without the kind of explicit engagement with criminal enterprise that Fletcher's New York or Modiford's Port Royal had required. Rogers himself was frequently absent from Nassau after his initial term. Financial difficulties, health problems, and the perennial under-resourcing of his administration sent him back to England repeatedly, and in his absences the colony drifted back toward the commercial habits that a generation of pirate culture had established. He returned for a second term in 1729 and died in Nassau in 1732, having spent his last years attempting to secure the financial recognition from the Crown that he believed his services warranted, and that the Crown consistently failed to provide in the amounts he considered just. The specific instrument of the Golden Age's closure was Woodes Rogers, and his story is one of the more extraordinary in the history of Atlantic maritime law enforcement. Rogers had been a privateer himself. His circumnavigation of 1708 to 1711 had been one of the most commercially successful privateering voyages in English history, producing among its other achievements the rescue of Alexander Selkirk from the uninhabited island where he had been marooned for 4 years, and who was the historical inspiration for Robinson Crusoe. Rogers knew the pirate world from inside, which made him both an effective opponent and an effective negotiator with the men he was sent to suppress. He was appointed governor of the Bahamas in 1717 and arrived at Nassau in July 1718 with a naval force sufficient to make resistance impractical and a royal pardon sufficient to make cooperation attractive. The pardon that Rogers carried, the act of grace that offered full forgiveness past piracy to any pirate who surrendered within a specified period, was the central instrument of his pacification strategy, and it worked better than its skeptics had expected and less completely than its architects had hoped. A significant portion of the Nassau pirate community accepted the pardon. Some of them, like Hornigold, took up positions in the colonial administration and spent their subsequent years hunting former colleagues. Some accepted the pardon and then returned to piracy when the legitimate employment that the pardon was supposed to channel them into proved inadequate to their needs or their temperaments. Others refused the pardon entirely and had to be dealt with by force. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, is the most famous pirate in the English language tradition, and the specific features of his fame are worth examining carefully, because they illuminate both the reality and the mythology of the Golden Age with unusual clarity. He operated at the intersection of the pirate haven and the corrupt colonial administration in ways that make him the most complete expression of how the haven functioned when it had fully penetrated the legitimate political order rather than merely coexisting alongside it. Teach was probably born in Bristol around 1680 and appears in the Caribbean historical record first as a privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession, operating out of Jamaica. After the war's end in 1714, he joined Benjamin Hornigold's crew at Nassau and quickly rose to his own command, displaying the combination of physical presence, tactical aggression, and theatrical self-presentation that would make him the most feared and most widely recognized pirate of his era. The specific theatre of his self-presentation is worth dwelling on, because it was not accidental. The slow-burning hemp cords woven into his enormous black beard that he lit before battle, wreathing his face in smoke, were a deliberate performance of supernatural menace calculated to produce exactly the psychological effect they produced. The conviction, in the crews of the ships he was approaching, that they were dealing with something more than human. Teach understood that his reputation was a military asset as useful as his cannon, and he invested in it accordingly. His career reached its most interesting phase after he took the Concorde, a French slave ship, in November 1717, converted it into the Queen Anne's Revenge, his flagship, and operated along the American eastern seaboard in 1717 and 1718 with a boldness that repeatedly humiliated the colonial authorities attempting to suppress him. He blockaded the harbour of Charleston, South Carolina, for several days in May 1718, stopping every ship entering or leaving and demanding a chest of medicines as ransom for the prominent passengers he held, a demand that the colonial government of South Carolina met, because the alternative was Blackbeard sinking ships in their harbour with no available force to stop him. The incident was a demonstration of how thin the enforcement capability of the colonial governments actually was in this period, and how completely the pirate haven's operations could expose that thinness. His arrangement with Charles Eden, the governor of North Carolina, was the most fully realized example of the corrupt colonial administrator as pirate enabler that the Golden Age produced. North Carolina in 1718 was a small, poorly resourced colony with limited commercial infrastructure and limited naval enforcement capability. and Eden's arrangement with Teach was straightforward. Teach based himself at Ocracoke Inlet on the North Carolina coast and provided Eden and the local Admiralty Court judge, Tobias Knight, with a share of his prizes, which Eden's court then legitimized through a process whose legal basis was creative rather than sound. Teach provided the prizes. Eden provided the documentation. Both profited. The arrangement was an example of what the regulatory tightening of the period was trying to eliminate, and its existence was precisely why the governors of Virginia, who were losing significant amounts of Atlantic trade revenue to Teach's depredations, and whose colonial administration was more capable and more motivated than Eden's, went over Eden's head to the British government and organised the naval expedition that ended Teach's career. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy engaged Blackbeard at Ocracoke Inlet on November 22, 1718, with 2 small sloops and a crew that was numerically inferior to Teach's. The engagement that followed was one of the most violent close-quarters naval combats of the entire Golden Age, fought in the shallow waters of the inlet in conditions that prevented the larger warships that would have made the engagement more one-sided from participating. Maynard lost a significant fraction of his crew in the initial exchange of fire. Teach led his men in a boarding action that appeared for a moment to be succeeding. Maynard and his surviving crew then emerged from the holds where they had sheltered against the enemy's blunderbuss fire, and fought Teach's men on the deck of his sloop in the kind of combat that the Golden Age mythology has always preferred to its naval equivalent. Teach was shot 5 times and stabbed approximately 20 times before he died. A quantity of injury that the mythology has found necessary to elaborate upon with various accounts of supernatural resilience, and that the history simply records as evidence of the specific physical toughness that a life of violence in the early 18th century could produce. Maynard had Teach's head cut off and hung from his bowsprit for the return voyage to Virginia, where it was displayed at the entrance to the harbour as a warning. Charles Vane, who sailed out of Nassau harbour with a defiant gesture toward Rogers's fleet, rather than accept the pardon, was eventually captured, tried, and hanged. Calico Jack Rackham, who accepted the pardon and then returned to piracy and was captured in Jamaican waters in 1720, was hanged at Port Royal. Blackbeard, who operated out of the Carolina coast rather than Nassau, and whose relationship with the colonial governor of North Carolina was one of the more creatively ambiguous in the history of piracy, was killed in a naval engagement off Ocracoke Island in November 1718 by a force from Virginia, whose commander, Lieutenant Robert Maynard, had been specifically sent to deal with him. The process by which Rogers transformed Nassau from a pirate haven into a functioning colonial settlement was not immediate or smooth. The pardoned pirates who remained in Nassau were not obviously adapted to the life of honest colonial commerce, and the transition from a community organised around prize money to one organised around legitimate trade was a social transformation as much as a political one. Rogers himself was a man of extraordinary personal toughness. He'd been shot through the jaw during the circumnavigation, lost part of the bone of his heel to another wound, and had managed a 3-year voyage through the Pacific and Indian Oceans, with the specific combination of firmness and flexibility that successful command requires. He needed all of those qualities to manage Nassau in the years following the pardon, dealing with the periodic temptations of pardoned pirates, the resistance of the merchant community to the new commercial order, and the chronic shortage of resources that characterized every colonial administration the proprietors of the Bahamas had ever appointed. The specific episode that most clearly demonstrated Rogers's commitment to the new order was the trial and execution of 8 former Nassau pirates in December 1718. men who had accepted the pardon and then returned to piracy, and whose prosecution and hanging at Nassau was conducted with the deliberateness that communicated Rogers's seriousness to every remaining pardoned pirate on the island. Rogers watched the executions from the Fort Nassau ramparts, reportedly without visible emotion, and the symbolic message of the event, that the pardon was not an amnesty for future behaviour but a specific conditional forgiveness for past sins, was received by the Nassau community with the combination of compliance and resentment that such messages typically generate. The question of what the pirate havens actually produced extends beyond the Caribbean to the American colonial mainland in ways that the standard histories of the Golden Age consistently underemphasize. The connection between the pirate haven and the colonial ports of North America, particularly New York, Boston, and the Rhode Island towns, was one of the most economically significant and most politically awkward features of the Golden Age, and it reveals the extent to which the pirate economy was not a marginal criminal enterprise, but an integral part of the commercial life of the early American colonies. New York under the governor Benjamin Fletcher in the 1690s was the most flagrant example of a colonial capital integrated into the pirate economy, and Fletcher himself was the most spectacularly corrupt of the colonial governors whose tolerance of piracy was the necessary condition of the pirate haven's prosperity. Fletcher received direct payments from pirate captains for the safe harbour that his administration provided. He issued privateering commissions to men whose activities bore no resemblance to privateering. He attended dinners given by pirate captains in New York Harbour and accepted gifts of gold and silver that were transparently the proceeds of Indian Ocean raiding. His administration of New York in the 1690s was, in effect, the northern branch of the same system of corrupt colonial accommodation that Modford had operated at Port Royal, a governor's commission converted into a mechanism for profiting from maritime crime while providing the legal and political protection that the crime required. The specific connection between New York and the Madagascar pirate settlements was the trade in provisions. The Madagascar pirates needed food, ammunition, clothing, and the various goods of European material culture that their Indian Ocean location did not provide. New York merchants, organized through what contemporaries called the Red Sea trade, supplied them, sending merchant vessels from New York loaded with provisions and manufactured goods, returning with the gold and silver and East Indian commodities that the pirates had taken from their prizes. The trade was substantial enough to have a measurable effect on New York prices, depressing the cost of luxury goods below what the legitimate trade could offer and attracting buyers from across the colonial commercial network. The Rhode Island connection was different in character, but equally significant. Rhode Island had been founded on principles of religious toleration and commercial pragmatism that made it more accommodating than most colonial administrations to commercial activities that other colonies found troubling, and the specific geography of Narragansett Bay provided the kind of sheltered multiple-entrance harbour that the pirate trade found convenient. The traders of Newport and Providence maintained commercial relationships with Nassau and with the pirates operating along the American coast that were documented in enough Admiralty court proceedings to give historians a reasonably clear picture of the trade's scale and organization. The specific goods that moved through Rhode Island's pirate connection, the East Indian textiles, the sugar and rum, the various commodities of prize cargoes, were available in Newport at prices that reflected their origins, and the Newport merchants who bought and sold them were as knowing about the source of their bargains as the Port Royal merchants who had preceded them. The question of what the pirate havens actually produced, what their specific contribution to the history of the Atlantic world was beyond the drama and the crime and the careers of their most celebrated inhabitants. is one that historians have approached from several directions and that does not have a single clean answer. The economic contribution of the pirate havens to the colonies that tolerated them was real and significant in specific periods. Port Royal's prosperity in the 1670s was built substantially on the prize economy, and the revenue that the Jamaica administration derived from the privateering enterprise, through taxes on prizes, through the commercial activity that prize money generated, through the naval protection that the privateers provided at no direct cost to the Crown, was a meaningful supplement to the legitimate sugar economy in the period before that economy had fully developed. Nassau's position as a centre of Atlantic commerce in the early 18th century was similarly built on a combination of legal and illegal trade that the colonial administration found difficult to separate even when it wanted to. The political contribution of the pirate havens to the broader history of Atlantic democracy is a claim that has been made by historians working from very different angles and that requires careful handling. The argument runs roughly as follows. The articles that governed pirate ships were among the most democratic governance documents in the early 18th century Atlantic world, providing for the election of officers, the collective management of prize distribution, and the specific legal protections, compensation for injury, due process before punishment, that the ordinary legal systems of the period did not provide to ordinary working people. The pirate community's internal democracy was limited in its application. It did not extend to the enslaved people who were taken in raids. It was enforced by a community of violent men whose collective governance was not always gentle. But within those limits it was genuinely democratic in ways that the societies surrounding it were not. Whether the pirate haven as an institution contributed to the broader development of democratic ideas in the Atlantic world is a question that historians like Marcus Rediker and Peter Linebaugh have argued for persuasively, and that other historians have found overstated, and the debate is ongoing. The contribution of the pirate havens to Atlantic commercial culture is perhaps the most straightforwardly accessible of the three, and it is a contribution that was, paradoxically, often positive in its economic effects, even when its legal status was negative. The pirate haven created what economists would now call a free trade zone, a place where the normal tariffs, restrictions and monopoly arrangements of colonial commerce did not apply, where goods could be bought and sold without the friction of the mercantilist system that the European colonial powers were imposing on Atlantic trade. The goods that moved through Nassau and Port Royal and Tortuga were available to buyers across the Caribbean and the Atlantic seaboard at prices that reflected the absence of tariffs and the specific economics of the prize trade, and the communities that had access to these goods, including the American colonial towns that maintained commercial relationships with Nassau in the early 18th century, derived real economic benefits from the lower prices that the pirate commercial network provided. The suppression of the pirate havens, the tightening of naval enforcement, the extension of Admiralty court jurisdiction, the Woodes Rogers moment in Nassau, was therefore a mixed economic blessing for the colonial world. It improved security of commerce, which the merchants and planters valued. It raised prices for goods that had previously been available through the prize network, which the consumers who had benefited from those prices found less welcome. It established the kind of institutional order that long-term commercial development requires, at the cost of the specific dynamism and flexibility that the ungoverned spaces had provided. The economic history of the Caribbean after the Golden Age is, in some respects, a story of what happened to a commercial world that had been partly organised around the prize economy when that economy was dismantled, and the answer is not entirely positive for the people at the lower end of the colonial social order who had derived the most benefit from the cheap goods and the commercial opportunities that the haven economy had provided. Madagascar deserves its own section, because it is the most improbable of all the Golden Age pirate havens, and the one whose specific character most clearly illustrates the extent to which the pirate haven was a response to opportunity rather than a fixed institution. Madagascar is a large island, the fourth largest in the world, off the southeastern coast of Africa, in the Indian Ocean rather than the Atlantic or the Caribbean, and its connection to the story of the Golden Age is a product of the specific commercial geography of the late 17th century. The Red Sea and the Indian Ocean were, in the 1690s, the richest maritime trade routes in the world. The Mughal Empire's pilgrimage traffic between India and the Arabian Peninsula, the spice trade of the East Indies, the trade between India and the Persian Gulf, the commerce of the East India Company, all of these moved through waters that were, in the early period of the Golden Age, considerably less well policed than the Caribbean, where the European colonial navies are seen present for generations. A pirate who could reach the Red Sea could attack ships carrying wealth of a kind that Caribbean prizes rarely matched, and the Mughal pilgrim ships in particular, large, heavily laden, and not designed for combat, were the most valuable single targets available to anyone willing to make the voyage. The route from the Caribbean and the Atlantic coast of North America to the Red Sea passed naturally around the southern tip of Africa and the island of Madagascar, large enough to provide provisioning and careening facilities, close enough to the Red Sea approaches to be a practical base, far enough from any effective European colonial authority to be ungoverned in the specific sense that pirates required, became the primary base for Indian Ocean piracy in the 1690s and early 1700s. The pirates who operated from Madagascar were not a different breed from the Caribbean buccaneers. Many of them were exactly the same men, or the sons and colleagues of the same men, following the commercial logic of piracy to whatever waters offered the richest targets and the least effective opposition. Henry Every, Longben Every, as he was known to his contemporaries, conducted the most spectacular single act of Indian Ocean piracy in the Golden Age when he and his consorts captured the Ganges Sawai, a large Mughal merchant ship, in 1695. The Ganges Sawai was carrying pilgrims returning from Mecca and their accumulated wealth, and the capture was accompanied by violence against the passengers, including the assault of women on the ship, that caused a diplomatic crisis between the Mughal Empire and the English East India Company, whose trade privileges in India the Mughal government threatened to revoke in retaliation. Every was never caught, disappearing from the historical record after the prize and becoming one of the most wanted men in the Atlantic world, a figure of such notoriety that Daniel Defoe wrote a novelised account of his life, and that the British government offered a substantial reward for his capture that was never claimed. The diplomatic consequences of his raid included the specific pressure on the English government to suppress Indian Ocean piracy that contributed to the regulatory tightening of the 1700s. The most fully realised expression of the Madagascar pirate community was the legendary settlement of Libertalia, a pirate utopia supposedly founded by a French captain named Misson and a renegade Italian priest named Caraccioli, whose constitution abolished slavery, established common property, and created a community of pirates on principles of radical equality. Libertalia appears in Captain Johnson's General History of the Pirates, the primary source for Golden Age piracy, as a fully realised political community with a republican constitution and a commitment to liberty that puts the surrounding colonial world to shame. Whether Libertalia actually existed, whether Misson and Caraccioli were real people and the settlement a real place, is one of the most contested questions in pirate history, and the scholarly consensus has moved toward treating Libertalia as a literary construction by Johnson rather than a historical community, though the debates continue. What is clear is that the Libertalia narrative captured something that contemporaries found plausible about the pirate community's potential. The idea that men who had opted out of the commercial and social order of the surrounding world might build something genuinely different if given the opportunity and the physical space. Whether they actually did so in Madagascar or not, the story has served as a vehicle for thinking about what alternative social arrangements might look like, and its persistence in the pirate mythology is evidence of the specific ideological charge that the pirate haven carried for the people of the Golden Age and for the historians who have written about them since. Abraham Samuel, a figure who actually did exist and who is documented in the records of the period, was a man of partly African ancestry who had been born enslaved in the Caribbean, had become a pirate, and had established himself as a local ruler in Madagascar in the 1690s, known to his Malagasy subjects and to the European traders and pirates who dealt with him as Tollenar, the king of the southeastern coast. Samuel's career is a demonstration that the pirate haven, in its most ungoverned expressions, could produce forms of social mobility that the surrounding colonial world made impossible. That a man who'd been born enslaved and had become a pirate could end up governing a coastal settlement and negotiating as an equal with the officers of the East India Company. His story is imperfectly documented, his subsequent fate unknown, but he stands as evidence that the social world of the pirate haven was more diverse and more complicated than the standard narrative of white European men in tall boots has typically suggested. The cultural legacy of the pirate haven has been, if anything, more durable than its political and economic legacy, and its durability reflects the specific appeal that the pirate world has always exercised over the imagination of people who find the commercial societies they inhabit more constraining than they would like. But before we assess the mythology, there is a final dimension of the pirate haven's historical reality that the mythology consistently misses. The specific texture of what it felt like to be in one of these places at the height of the Golden Age, from the inside. The Port Royal of the 1680s, by all accounts, was overwhelming in its sensory impact. The waterfront smelled of tar and fish, and the rum that spilled from the tavern doorways, and the specific salt and rot smell of a wooden harbour town in a tropical climate. The noise was continuous. The creak of ships at their moorings, the shouts of workers on the wharves, the music from the taverns that ran through the night in a town where the boundary between day and night was more permeable than in most places, because the business of the pirate economy did not respect diurnal norms. The light was the specific Caribbean light, intense and bleaching at midday, and warm and amber in the evening, making the harbour water look like hammered metal in the late afternoon and like black silk after dark. The people were from everywhere, English and Welsh and Irish and Scottish, French and Dutch and Portuguese, African sailors and enslaved dock workers and free people of colour who occupied the specific niche that the social ambiguity of the pirate economy created for them. The languages mixed on the waterfront in ways that the linguists of the period would have found fascinating, and that the people actually living in it found merely normal. The functional multilingualism of a port that could not afford to be monolingual. Nassau in 1717 would have been smaller and rougher than Port Royal at its height, but the same sensory density applied. The harbour full of ships from dozens of origins, the waterfront dense with activity, the specific social energy of a community that knew it was operating outside the normal rules and that had, in some degree, made a conscious choice of that operating mode. A choice that gave the community a specific kind of self-awareness, an understanding of its own anomalousness, that expressed itself in the specific gallows humour and the specific bravado, and the specific democratic insistence on individual dignity that the pirate culture had developed. And its durability reflects the specific appeal that the pirate world has always exercised over the imagination of people who find the commercial societies they inhabit more constraining than they would like. The pirate haven was, in its most idealized form, a place where the rules of the surrounding world did not apply, where social hierarchy was less rigid, where wealth could be accumulated without the laborious deference that legitimate commerce required, where men of no birth and no connections could command ships and crews and take a share of the commercial wealth of the Atlantic world that the legitimate order had reserved for those with capital and status and the right relationships. This appeal has never entirely disappeared, and its persistence in the cultural imagination, in the novels of Stevenson and Defoe and their successors, in the films and the television series and the games that have made the golden age of piracy one of the most thoroughly exploited historical settings in popular culture, reflects a genuine and continuous human need for the idea of a place outside the rules, a haven from the constraints that organized society imposes. The gap between this idealized pirate haven and the historical reality is, as we've been tracing throughout this evening, considerable. The real pirate havens were not utopias of freedom and equality. They were commercial enterprises organized around crime, sustained by the specific needs of violent men and the merchants who profited from their violence, and they produced as much exploitation and suffering as they produced freedom and opportunity. The enslaved people who moved through Port Royal's wharves were not experiencing the commercial freedom of the haven. The passengers of the ships the pirates took were not experiencing the democratic ideals of the Articles. The women whose presence in the haven economies was essential and whose historical visibility was minimal were not experiencing the radical equality that the most enthusiastic accounts of pirate democracy claim for the pirate community. But the idealized haven and the historical haven are not entirely disconnected, and the specific features of the historical haven that have attached themselves to the popular imagination did so because they were real. The Articles were real. The election of captains was real. The compensation schedules for combat injuries were real. The specific community that developed at Nassau between 1714 and 1718, and that maintained itself in the absence of any external authority for several years, was real, and its self-maintenance was a genuine social achievement, however imperfect and however violent. The specific appeal of the pirate haven to men at the bottom of the Atlantic social order, men who had no access to the property and the status that the legitimate commercial world required for success, was real, and its appeal was a direct response to the specific injustices of the world that surrounded the havens, and that the havens, in their best moments, offered an alternative to. One of the most significant and least discussed dimensions of the pirate haven is its relationship to the Atlantic slave trade, the trade that was, in the same decades as the Golden Age, transforming the Caribbean from a region of mixed colonial economy into the monoculture plantation system that the 19th century would inherit. The intersection of piracy and the slave trade was not incidental to either enterprise but structural, and examining it honestly changes the moral landscape of the Golden Age in ways that the Romantic mythology has consistently preferred to avoid. The pirate haven was embedded in the Atlantic slave economy in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The rum and sugar that were the basic commodities of the haven's commercial life were products of plantation agriculture worked by enslaved people. The merchant vessels that the pirates attacked were, many of them, ships engaged in the Atlantic trade that the slave economy generated and required. The ports that served as pirate havens, Port Royal, Nassau, the Rhode Island towns, were also active participants in the slave trade. Their merchant establishments involved in the purchase and resale of enslaved people with the same commercial logic that organized every other dimension of their business. The specific question of what pirates did when they captured slave ships, vessels in the Middle Passage carrying enslaved people from West Africa to the Caribbean and the American mainland, is one that the historical record answers with uncomfortable complexity. Pirates captured slave ships regularly. The Fleda Galley, Bellamy's flagship, was itself a converted slave ship. The behaviour of pirates toward the enslaved people on the ships they captured varied enormously and without apparent principle. Some freed them, some enslaved them, some pressed them into service as crew members, some sold them in the nearest available market. The pirate articles that specified equal shares of prizes for every crew member did not typically specify what category of persons a captured enslaved person fell into, whether they were prize goods to be sold or human beings to be freed or potential recruits to be offered the choice of joining the crew. There were black pirates throughout the Golden Age, and their presence complicates the simple narrative of piracy as a form of white working-class resistance to the commercial order in important ways. Men of African ancestry served on pirate crews in numbers that the limited surviving records document imperfectly, but that historians working from those records have found to be significant. Some estimates suggest that black sailors constituted as much as 20 to 25% of some Golden Age pirate crews. Some were formerly enslaved people who had escaped bondage through the pirate crew as one of the very few mechanisms available for such escape in the early 18th century Caribbean. Some were free black sailors who had made their way into the maritime economy through the specific channels that the Atlantic trade provided for men of navigational skill regardless of race. Some occupied leadership positions in the pirate community that the surrounding colonial world would have made impossible. The pirate haven was, for these men, something genuinely different from what it was for their white colleagues. For a man who'd escaped enslavement and found his way to a pirate crew, the Nassau Republic was not merely an alternative commercial arrangement or a protest against the wage rates of the merchant marine. It was a space in which his humanity was acknowledged in the articles he signed and the vote he cast, in a world that had systematically denied it, and whose alternative to the pirate life was enslavement rather than the merely inadequate employment that drove most white recruits to the pirate trade. The democratizing institutions of the pirate community, the articles, the elected captain, the equal voice in decisions, meant something qualitatively different to men for whom the alternative was not merely low wages, but human property status, and the pirate haven's appeal to men in that position was correspondingly more absolute. Captain Charles Johnson's General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, is the document most responsible for shaping the cultural legacy of the Golden Age, and it deserved a moment's attention because the relationship between its historical content and its literary construction is exactly the kind of relationship that the pirate haven's cultural legacy embodies. Johnson, whose identity has been debated by scholars for 300 years, with Daniel Defoe being the most frequently proposed candidate, a claim that modern scholarship has found plausible but not proven, wrote a history that was based on real events and real people, but that was organized and presented in ways that served narrative and ideological purposes as much as historical accuracy. He invented the Libertalia narrative, or elaborated it beyond anything that the historical evidence supports. He shaped the characterizations of the captains he described, Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, Mary Red, and Anne Bonny, in ways that gave them the specific narrative forms they have carried ever since. He was writing history as entertainment, in the tradition of the popular literature of the early 18th century, and his history has been more influential in shaping the popular understanding of the Golden Age than any subsequent work of actual scholarship. The physical traces of the pirate haven that archaeology has recovered, the Port Royal site, the Whydah wreck, the various colonial-era harbour excavations that have produced the material culture of the Golden Age, provide a corrective to the Johnson narrative and their specificity and their material honesty. The artefacts of the pirate world are not the artefacts of freedom and adventure. They are the artefacts of working men and women in a dangerous trade, living in cramped and uncomfortable conditions, dying of tropical disease and combat wounds and the consequences of excessive alcohol, and leaving behind them the same material debris, the broken pottery and the worn shoe soles and the discarded food bones, that characterizes the archaeological record of any working-class community of the period. The Golden Age was real, and its reality was messier and harder and more complicated than the stories that have been told about it. The night is settling in now, and the long story of the pirate havens has reached the end of the period that most clearly defines it. The Golden Age closed in the 1720s, the haven at Nassau dismantled by Woodes Rogers, the haven at Port Royal already ended by earthquake and commercial evolution, the Madagascar settlements dispersed by the attention of the European East India companies that the Indian Ocean piracy had provoked. What remained was a legal framework for the suppression of piracy that the major colonial powers maintained with increasing effectiveness across the rest of the 18th century, and a cultural mythology of the pirate haven that has shown no signs of ending, and that has been, across the 3 centuries since Bartholomew Roberts was shot dead on his quarterdeck and the Golden Age closed, one of the most persistently productive historical settings for the human imagination. The harbour at Nassau is full of tourist boats today, and the Atlantis resort rises from Paradise Island across the bridge like something from a dream about money, and the streets of the old town are lined with shops selling rum cake and straw goods and the specific artefacts of a tourism industry that has decided that its most marketable history is the pirate history. There is something correct about this. Nassau's specific claim on the world's imagination is the Golden Age, and the Golden Age's specific appeal has not diminished in 300 years of cultivation by novelists and filmmakers, and now theme park designers. The Blackbeard's rum franchise and the Pirates of Nassau Museum and the various tour operators who offer pirate-themed excursions are the 21st century's version of the same commercial logic that organised the original haven, giving people what they want at a profit, without asking too many questions about the intellectual heritage of the product. The harbour at Nassau is full of tourist boats today. The Bahamas are an independent nation. The British colonial administration that Woodes Rogers imposed a distant memory, the Pirate Republic an even more distant one. But the harbour still has the specific quality of light on water that the Caribbean provides in the late afternoon, and the narrow streets of the old town still carry something of the density and the commercial energy that characterised the haven in its glory years, however thoroughly the tourism industry has replaced the prize economy as the organising principle of the local commercial life. Port Royal is there too. Reduced, still partly submerged, the ruined fort at the end of the palisadoes a reminder of what was here and what happened to it. Divers still find things in the harbour mud. The church tower that photographs show rising from the water after the 1692 earthquake, the specific image that the providential narrative required and that the earthquake provided, is still there in reproduction and in memory, a marker for the place where the wharves and the taverns and the warehouses were before the ground liquefied and the world that had been built on it slid into the sea. The artefacts are in museums, the gold chains recovered from the Whydah, the pewter dishes from Simon Benning's shop on the bottom of Kingston Harbour, the stopped watches, the personal objects of the men and women who lived in the havens and died in them, or were dispersed from them when the political wind shifted and the governors came with pardons in one hand and gallows warrants in the other. The material record of people who were operating outside the rules of their world and who were, in their way, entirely human, greedy and brave and violent and occasionally democratic and occasionally generous, and always specific in the particular, irreducible way that individual human beings are specific, whatever the mythology that gets built around them afterward. Let that settle around you now. The Caribbean is warm and dark tonight, and the water in the harbour at Nassau is the same water that the pirate ships rode at anchor in 1717, more or less, if you discount the chemistry. The wickedest city on earth is a cruise ship destination. The Republic of Pirates is a nation of 300,000 people with its own parliament and its own flag. The Golden Age is gone, and the haven is memory, and the stories that have been told about it are, in the end, stories about the same thing that all stories about ungoverned spaces are stories about. The human desire for a place outside the rules, and the human inability to build such a place without eventually bringing the rules back in. Rest easy.